Matt Domo and I sit down to discuss his storied background from Microsoft, Amazon, Parallels, Rackspace, to running his own consultancy. Matt helped build and manage the teams who built many of the most used software as a service and infrastructure as a service offerings. We discuss why smartphones aren't better, databases as a service, compartmentalization of code, and virtualization, as well as how to think about technical debt. We also touch on open source and whether it should be used in a business context. Lastly, we jump into how he thinks about building and deciding on the technologies behind companies that need to scale. With that, please enjoy my conversation with Matt Domo. Hello and welcome to the Arsenic Show. Today I have with me Matt Domo. How are you, sir?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. Excited to be here.
Yeah. Well, so normally I don't ask questions about people's childhood because I don't think it's relevant to their conversation that we're going to be having. But in this case, I think it actually is kind of cool. So your dad was a police officer.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So can you tell us about what it's like growing up as a cop's kid?
It's an adventure. So not only was he a police officer, but he was a general's bodyguard in the Korean War. So he came back from Korea, then went to Washington State and continued to be the general's bodyguard, and then said, "Hey, I have enough of the rain, miss my family, want to go home." And he settled into law enforcement. And so, growing up policeman's son is kind of an interesting thing. When you're little, it's kind of cool. Dad's got the gun. You get to ride in a squad car. People look at you interesting. When you get older, people have expectations of you. Mm-hmm. And so, and they have expectations that they're going to try to trip you up, which people don't tell you. You're the cop's kid. You have to, be a certain way, act a certain way, and they have high expectations. And so, it's an interesting paradigm. You have to walk a fine line, right? Mm-hmm. And growing up as a teenager, it was especially hard, right? Because that's the age where we're trying to find ourselves, discover our social character. That's the formative years. Mm-hmm.
And break all the laws.
And break all the laws, which is positive, right? And negative. The positive side, you can get away with a little bit more. The negative side, dad's always waiting when you got home. Mm-hmm. So, it was formative. It was good. Learned quite a few things. And yeah.
So would you recommend it? Would you say this was a good childhood, or would you say that was a...
I think I had a really good childhood. I don't know if I'd recommend it in today's times, but back then I think it was fine.
So do you think that might have forced you to grow up too fast, or do you think that you were able to stay a child longer? How would you say that ended up forming you?
I think it matured me. So and to an extent, I've always had the kind of the rush of, trying to want to push the envelope a little bit. And that led into my professional life and things of that nature. But it also taught me that bad stuff happens and people don't like to talk about it. They don't expect it. It happens. And there's people out there that's what they deal with. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example. When I was a sophomore in high school, my girlfriend had a moped, and my dad never wanted me to have a motorcycle. So I was, of course, cruising around, and of course I went super fast on the moped. Mm-hmm. So one Friday night, he wakes me up at some ungodly hour because he was also the safety expert of the city. And he takes me out to an accident, and a guy on a motorcycle had been going too fast. Car pulled in front of him. He hit the car and flew an enormous amount of feet in the air, bounced 3 times, didn't have a helmet on. Mm-hmm. And he made me stand at his feet while they were treating him. And he's like, "Is this what you want? Riding on that moped, riding on a motorcycle, is this what you want to end up like?" And it was kind of baptism by fire, growing up in reality. I mean, it was a gruesome scene, I will tell you. And I didn't expect it, when my father just wakes me up in the middle of the night. But it's kind of like the school of hard knocks, right? You, and that's the reality of life. These things do happen, and you take them for granted, but it prepares you for things. And so I think it made me tougher.
Yeah, I've always thought of it sort of, I think the best analogy I've heard of motorcycles in particular, since you mentioned it, was imagine you are the best motorcycle rider in the world or whatever, and you're hit by a 6,000-pound car. Who's going to win?
Yeah, you're going to lose.
You're going to lose.
Yeah, you're going to lose. There's no doubt.
So it doesn't matter how good you are. Ultimately, you're still at the mercy of the people around you who are driving like idiots or just don't see you or whatever. So, yeah. So how did that end up kind of making you decide to get into technology? I mean, you're just like, I don't want to you didn't want to follow his footsteps. You didn't want to become a beat cop. You're like, no, I want to do technology. Like, how did that happen?
Oh, that actually started way back when in second grade. I was, interested in technology, just, all about what's the bleeding edge, the cool new things, and actually did a science fair when I was in fifth grade about computers, and we went pretty far in Northeast Ohio. Didn't go all the way to states, but finished pretty far, and was just always interested in computers because I just felt like I've always been like, what's the future? What's going to drive change? What's going to make life better? And from
a sci-fi perspective, like distant future.
Yeah. Well, like maybe not distant future, but what's going to propel society forward. And I kept coming back to technology. So, it really didn't, the police officer angle really didn't help me. What it did do is drive the focus. My parents were very driven people. And so they instilled in my brothers and I the drive to move forward, the drive to succeed, the drive to accomplish things, the drive to provide a better life for your children. And so they were always like, whatever you do, pour your best into it and work really hard. And the technology stuff came in line, with that. And then I worked hard. I grew up in Cleveland. It snows a lot. Mm-hmm. It was cold. Shoveled snow, mowed lawns, delivered newspapers, score kept baseball games, saved up a lot of money, bought my first computer in 9th grade, and started programming. And after football practice, I was also a football player. And I was hooked. And so knew I wanted to do that. And, my dad, the police officer, again, it was all about what I learned about him as he ultimately became chief. And I learned about how the leadership part of it, I learned what to do, but also, the military stuff of what not to do. Because you can't lead software engineers like a military guy.
No, right.
So
well, you can try.
But you won't last long. So that's kind of the whole mix.
Mm-hmm. Got it. So how'd you end up at Microsoft?
I was hired out of college. I was studying at Ohio State University, and I was hired by Fox Pro Software. They were one of the first desktop databases. They were there, and the recruiter just set the hook. She's like, "Look, you're a perfect fit. We may get bought by Microsoft, so give me 30 days. Your start date is here. If you show up, great. We'd love it. If not, you're scared. I totally understand. You may find another job. I'm not going to hold you to it." Mm-hmm. So about 30 days later, unannounced, they call and say, "Hey, Microsoft wants to talk to you." And so I had been to a happy hour because my last quarter, I took pretty easy classes. I was also debating whether to go to my master's degree. And so they
in what?
In computer science.
Okay.
Specialized in database and operating system design. And they interviewed me for 2.5 hours. And it went pretty well. The next day I had an offer letter sitting in my front door. And I became a Microsoft employee. And then the rest is off to the races.
So what did you end up doing when you got there? What did you build? What did you do, sir?
Yeah. So I worked on Fox initially, and then moved over to SQL Server. Back then, I'm dating myself. we used to license code. Windows NT and the Windows Server operating system kind of didn't exist or was being built. And we were porting the database code from Sybase. We licensed the code. And so I was a developer working on that. And so, we were repairing a lot of things. So my first job was like, make it better. Mm-hmm. And so, I started working on fixing issues. Like we would have Pennzoil. This is a long time ago, so no one's going to shoot me for telling you. And so the Pennzoil was using the database to track flows and metrics for all the oil going through all their refineries. And we had a bug where if this trigger fired and it had a certain condition, rather than update it, it would just delete all the data. Mm-hmm. And so
that's one way to end up with a lot of extra oil.
Yeah, exactly. So we had to, that was one of my first jobs. It was to discover that and then go fix it. And just things like that. And then I just kind of rose up from there.
That's kind of funny because people really think of databases as, perfect data, immutable. It's always what it is. But really, it's just another program written by developers who can make technical errors just like any other place.
You can. I will say the Sybase stuff wasn't as good as which is why we chose to ultimately rewrite it. Mm-hmm. We had a license agreement with them, and, they're not, everybody, a developer always says the previous guy's stuff's not as good. I have to rewrite it. Just everybody thinks they can build the better mousetrap.
Yes.
In this case, we could build the better mousetrap.
But a lot of times it's true because if you're looking at something and you're like, wow, I like this and this and this about it, but I hate this and this and this. Oftentimes the second version is actually better.
And it was. It was orders of magnitude better.
So when we talked, you kind of made me think. You were like, I think you said this was like one of the very first SaaS platforms ever.
Well, when I was when I worked on SQL Server, I wound up doing things that I guess I was young and ambitious. And back to my teachings as a kid, then he said, "Hey, we need failover clustering in an enterprise offering. And, we need to prove to the enterprise we're, quote, enterprise ready." Mm-hmm. And we've been working on this. We can't, we have a limited amount of time window and we need to make this happen. And so I said, okay, I'll do it. And we had a small team and just figure out what's in the enterprise edition of SQL Server. And we came down to some features with larger memory and failover clustering. So a clustered database, different failovers, active, passive, active, active. And so I designed all that and then led the creation of it. And we made the milestone when no one thought we would make it. And so then from there, I wound up growing a pretty large organization. And then more stuff like that came on. Like we had to, in addition to that, we had to have XML storage in the database because web applications were being built by XML. We had to figure out how to store it. So I built a team in addition to that, and we figured out how to do it. And then
that's pretty advanced. I mean,
it was hardcore stuff because there wasn't a schema definition
and also searchable.
And searchable wow. and queryable, and it was clunky. I'll say that it was not as elegant as stuff is today, but it worked. And so I kind of rose up and wound up having a pretty large team, couple hundred people within a couple years, and so that's kind of where I kind of grew up, if you will.
So were you there when SQL Slammer came about?
I can't remember that one, to be honest.
So it was a vulnerability.
Vulnerability, yeah.
Yeah,
I think so.
There was a guy named Dave Litchfield who came up with this vulnerability, and it was bad, but on the grand scheme of things, it wasn't that bad. Although it was bad enough that everybody was forced to patch. And by his estimation, before SQL Slammer came out, less than 1 out of 10 of the servers he interrogated during his tests were up to date, and afterwards, more like 1 out of 10 weren't up to date. So, in a very strange way, whatever happened during that project, it actually kind of kicked off we need updated software revolution.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an interesting little tidbit about security history there.
Yeah, security became a big deal in Microsoft because uh, people complained about Microsoft and its security practices, and I'll say it wasn't the forefront of everything. But to their defense, I mean, hundreds of millions of users, like people are gonna find things. You only have so many people, right? And so there's a large surface area.
Yep.
So, and there's bad guys trying to do bad things all the time. So, in their defense, it's going to happen. And then it became a serious issue because it was damaging customers. And so legions of people were focused on fixing security and making it a core part of the development process. And that's when things started to get better.
Yeah, I think I was even working as a contractor right around the same time as they announced they were going to have this trusted computing initiative. And all of a sudden it was, hundreds of millions of dollars poured just into security, just all of a sudden. And really fairly much basically overnight, you saw this massive increase in security, new ways of thinking about security, new security research coming out of that, that division. Just it's pretty remarkable, considering what a big kind of old company Microsoft was at that point. It was already decades past its prime in terms of, brand new innovation or whatever. So kind of interesting. So with the SaaS product, this was really the very first time you were starting to move to more like business in the cloud. Like you could actually have business in a box. You could kind of almost sort of construct a company out of the Tinker toys that were available on the internet. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So the product was called bCentral, and it was one of our 5 important strategic bets in Microsoft at the time. The leader was Satya Nadella, who's now the CEO of Microsoft. He was my boss. I led architecture and a core platform development, and it was all around getting the small business online. It was geared towards small businesses and helping them operate online. So it was built by products we had plus acquisitions we had. So one was to build and help quick tools and then host their website. Mm-hmm. And then we had an acquisition, Link Exchange. Years gone by, they were the founders of email marketing. So we were the founders of spam.
There you go.
so it was all about LinkedIn, email marketing campaigns. Then we had banner ads, and then we had online accounting. We had a SaaS accounting, and then we had CRM. And then we would keep adding things around the back office and the front office elements of running a small business. And we learned a lot of things. One of which was a little ahead of its time.
Of course it was. Probably 2 decades ahead of its time.
And so the other thing is it was different than anything else. Microsoft had done shrink wrap software to that standpoint. You had waterfall, and you had to change your development model because you're controlling everything, and you had to move quickly because people wanted capabilities, and you didn't have the CD printing process and the fear of making a mistake because then you'd have to resend out media, and we didn't know how to do it. We were kind of figuring it out as we went, and that brought in a whole genesis of things to come about how to iterate, I'd say Waggle. So different iterative development models and, how to host things at scale. I mean, we had a lot of users, and it broke some of our products, like core Microsoft products.
Sure.
And so there were a lot of benefits from there. And then we also figured out that medium-sized business at the time was actually the core market. Not as much small businesses, because candidly, the internet it's not as pervasive as it is today back then. And so, but medium-sized businesses had the wherewithal, the money predominantly, and the appetite to kind of grow that as a business. And so we went out and looked at Great Plains. And Great Plains was accounting and a few other packages. And so we went and acquired Great Plains Software, which ultimately went on to become Microsoft Dynamics. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of came into bCentral. And that's kind of the lineology, if you will, of what happened.
Microsoft made some really big bets around that time frame, like live.com, which still exists to the day. But having a centralized form of authentication, like basically every big company on earth was racing to get that deployed. Even eBay, everybody wanted it. Google wanted it. Yahoo wanted it. Everybody was trying to come up with a federated identity model where as long as you have access to LinkedIn or whatever, you suddenly have access to everything else. But I remember when I was at Realtor.com, the day that they chose to withdraw the single sign-on functionality within Live.com, and all hell broke loose. This is like all of a sudden lots of users can't log in. They wanted to log in through their Hotmail account or whatever, and they couldn't. So Microsoft really was sort of this central point of a lot of this crazy technology that a lot of people just didn't know it even existed per se.
Or they took for granted.
Yeah, they took for granted. And all of a sudden when it's gone, which is one of the reasons I'm always very wary of cloud-based SaaS applications, especially when it's run by companies like Google, because they have a history of just yanking out access. Like dozens of companies, sub-companies just yanked out, just pull the plug. So Microsoft, that's the one time I remember them really pulling the plug on something that was pretty vital that impacted anybody I was aware of. But the other one that I saw that was interesting was the Hotmail, the acquisition of Hotmail, I think it was. That was an interesting one. Were you around at that time?
I was, yes.
I remember all the engineers I was talking to were all just like laughing about how it was like 3 times the amount of machines to get it working. And it was, trying to port everything over from, I think it was FreeBSD onto a Windows platform. And
it was back then Microsoft was kind of not Microsoft software. They were interested in buying customers. It was about buying customers and buying markets predominantly. And one of the first things they tried to do is bring them into the Borg, or Microsoftized them. Mm-hmm. And so, which really meant we're going to rewrite it on Microsoft technology. Did you really need to do that? Not quite sure. I think they're still learning that, right? But scalability was definitely a challenge with Hotmail.
Absolutely.
And a few other things too.
So I have this fun project that I had been running for quite a while, actually, called Smartphone Exec. And the entire idea is, could you run a business from a smartphone? Just a smartphone. I don't mean like with a kicker with a laptop sitting off to the side or something. I mean, just a cell phone. And the short answer is no, or like not easily anyway. But it was a really, really fascinating, just deep dive into mobile technology that I had not bothered to do up to that point. And I got pretty far along. I got to the point where I was basically using my cell phone for everything. I had a little fold-out laptop and, pop them. And I actually have photos of people. There's a number of photos of people taken of me working on my foldable keyboard with this little tiny little iPhone kind of thing. But for me, one of the reasons I don't like the mobile environment as far as running a company is I also do some programming work, just setting up the websites and that kind of stuff, even very simple programming work, just to make sure, this thing talks to this thing or whatever. And it turns out having a tiny little form factor is really difficult when you need to context switch between, what somebody's saying about how to program the thing and how to program the thing. And you got to switch back and forth. So I always liked the idea of something Microsoft had created called Continuum. And the entire context of Continuum was, wouldn't it be great if I could walk up with my cell phone, put it down, and all of a sudden I have my full desktop environment with the same files and even running the same programs all of a sudden ported over, and it's all running on a nice big screen where I can do that context switching, and I have a full big keyboard and, a side mouse that's actually more functional and that kind of thing. And I was very bummed to see that Microsoft killed that project. But so the way I think about it is Microsoft had a desktop operating system and a mobile operating system that were both open. You could install whatever you wanted on them. You had reasonably good access to the file system. You could pretty much do whatever you want on it. Apple has a very open desktop, but a very closed phone. So there's switching between the two is actually much more complicated because you don't have easy access to the file system. I can't like drill down to things as easily on an iPhone. It tries to kind of stop you from doing that. There are ways to do it, but it's more tricky. And then you have like the Android operating system, which is extremely closed, but the phone, which is extremely open. So again, this
different
weird
spectrum.
Yeah, they're all different. So Microsoft of the three was the best suited to actually do this. And I felt like they were going to do it. I mean, not just because of Continuous. Actually, before this, I thought they were going to do it because if you look at the Metro operating system, which was weird and clunky, and they never quite explained why it existed. They're like, oh, it's for mobile, but everyone's like, why? I don't care. It's weird and clunky. But if you watched it over the period of time, it like gradually got smaller and smaller, and then it fit into the start. When you click the start button, there was this little window that popped up, and that looked an awful lot like Metro and acted like Metro, and you could launch Metro apps from it, which looked a lot like the same form factor as a cell phone. So I figured that's what was happening there. Like the mobile operating system was going to be combined, and that would be your start button. And all that Metro stuff would be driven from there, except on desktop where it would know, hey, you're on desktop, go ahead and launch the full version. So what the hell happened? Why can't I just walk up to a device, throw my phone down, and it just knows what I was doing?
Well, I think there's a myriad of things there.
Sure.
And it's a multi-step thing. So if you will go as far as you want to go.
Sure, yeah, let's do it.
So first off, Microsoft, they had the mobile market initially. You know, they had Windows CE. We were running around with Pocket PCs, and they had it. It was a stylus, but they had it. The synchronization with it was weak. You know, synchronizing with, you had to tether it to your desktop and synchronizing it. It was kind of weak. The user experience, they wanted to make it Windows-like, but how do you do a stylus on Windows? It was a little ahead of its time. Mm-hmm. So what made it a little different? First off, Apple, you either have to be first, you have to have cheapest, and somewhere in between is quality. They had first, definitely weren't cheapest, because they charged everybody for the Windows operating system, all the OEMs, which made the price point pretty high. It wasn't the easiest to use. It was better than anything else out there, not the easiest to use. So Apple came out with something that was revolutionary, a pretty simple thing. I touch. It's pretty simple and elegant. Kind of like
even my cat can do it.
Even your cat can do it. And so that started to get people to think a little differently. So now we're talking about the outside of the house. That sounds
like an ad right there.
Yeah. So that's the outside of the house. You know what you see. It was simple, it was elegant, it was innovative. The inside of the house. Microsoft was very tech forward, as we know. And it was all about pushing the edge technology wise. The API design for a developer was really, really hard. I mean, Windows was hard to develop for, but it was the only game in town for a long time. So it was like, let's make the Windows experience the same on the device. Well, the device has different runtime characteristics. It has all the things you talk about for compute, network, and storage. It's just different. And it has to be different. You don't have to worry about layers of device drivers and all that stuff. But network is unreliable. So if I'm going to sync with you, sync with your device, how do I make that reliable, right? And the programming interfaces for the developer to write applications was hard. You know, the differences between the desktop, it is elegant, like what you're saying, but in practice, to write that code, there's a lot of tricks that you have to do, and you have to write an interface that runs over all the different types of phones that are going to run the Windows operating system. And so because of all that friction, they didn't win the hearts and minds of developers. And so Apple and Google figured out, like, simple and easy. We can debate whether the Android operating system's easy. We can debate that. But they got easy. One was cheap. One was locked down. They both knew how to get developers. and they had their stores. And so that attracted people to the platform. Microsoft never really they were late to the game with enticing developers about how their ecosystem they could make money. It was all about enticing developers to port their app to run on the device, but the incentives weren't. The incentives were skewed still towards Microsoft. So now let's lay it out. Probably it was an innovative interface. Not simple to program against, so there's some friction and therefore cost for the developer that's writing the program to do. There are some idiosyncrasies that are different than anybody else. I mean, you could look at a program today. If you run on the iPhone, some parts of it'll take 27 lines of code on an iPhone and maybe 500 on an Android. Microsoft might be larger than that with its programming interface. So, what's the incentive? And then the idiosyncrasies of the difference of the hardware itself, what you get on the device versus what you get on a laptop. It is different, and it's just hard to make that simple. So that's my long-winded answer for you.
Well, I could go even deeper. So Google, for instance, they really lock down access. So I can't create a Android device that does have the Google apps and access to the App Store unless all things are locked down to Google, including search. So the problem with that is I can't have a sort of a sideloader with all my own. I can't build Continuum because they're going to say, well, you can't do all this other stuff. You got to use our stuff. You got to use our stuff. And so
Microsoft, same way.
Yeah. And so, but Microsoft's problem is, I think you're right. I think their biggest problem is they really never had the developer store. They never had that ecosystem, the place where I can go download all of the Windows apps. I mean, it came later, but it was not as robust. I mean, I was searching through it maybe a handful of years ago, and I'm like, wow, there's dozens of apps, not hundreds of thousands of apps. This is very sparse. The Metro App Store in particular, which would have been the mobile device. That's everything. That's all all 12 apps you can have, or whatever it was. So obviously, I think it grew, but not by the leaps and bounds that you would have to kind of expect. I mean, I need Uber on there. I need, the ability to, contact people over Signal or whatever. I mean, there's all these apps that are missing from that environment. And I think that made it much, much worse, or even totally untenable from the perspective of Microsoft. Like, why are we just pouring money into this thing?
And they always try to take it from Windows to here, Windows everywhere.
Right.
Did it have to be Windows everywhere?
Right. Well, apparently not, because now you have sort of Cygwin-like things built directly. You have full Ubuntu built directly into the operating system. And you can run Ubuntu apps directly. You just have to enable some flags, and all of a sudden you're running it. So clearly Microsoft isn't married to the operating system, nor should it have ever been. It's really more about the users. And watching Microsoft, I'm sure far after you've left, has been an interesting thing. A friend of mine was in charge of deciding, or part of the decision about moving away from using Edge, the native code Edge, and moving more towards Chromium. And I told them, do not do that. You're going to lose your autonomy. You're always going to be months, maybe much more than months behind Google. Like, just don't do it. Don't do it. You're going to waste. I realize you're cutting some headcount and that's nice or whatever, but you're basically wasting your last ditch effort. Like, you're never, ever going to get this back, unless you fully start from scratch kind of thing. And they did not agree. And now we have even less diversity in the user agents out there. So it's been interesting to watch that. But that's all about ad revenue. So from their perspective, it's not about Edge, it's about Bing. Like, how do we get people using Bing?
Bing.
Yeah.
Yep.
So we don't really care if the code is written by Google. We just need to make sure that the search box is Bing, which goes back to ad revenue. So that's been interesting in watching Cortana come up. And so where do you think things are going for Microsoft? What do you think their sort of next big hit's going to be? Because it seems like they're getting their lunch eaten on the consumer side, but I have a feeling there's a whole bunch more under the hood coming on the Azure and business side.
I think you've hit one of it. Like they're stepping away from the consumer side. I mean, the Xbox, but the Xbox is starting to fall behind Sony and the PlayStation. And they are taking a different tack now than Sony and the PlayStation. And so I think that will be an anchor, but I don't know if they'll overtake PlayStation. They had it for a while, and then they didn't.
I'm actually friends with Seamus Blackley. Maybe I'll bring him in here one of these days.
That'd be good. That'd be a really good discussion.
Yeah, he's an interesting guy.
He's
a physicist.
I think you're right. The consumer, it's just not their play. I think where they're going to really make a heyday is the cloud. And there's a couple reasons for that. One, right or wrong, good or bad, Windows is the desktop of business. And figuring out how to marry the desktop of business to making it easy to use cloud business applications like Office 360, Dynamics, all that, and weaving it in a simple experience. And then the different pace of services that are going to come out in Azure is a difference maker. They have the enterprise, an outstanding footprint in the enterprise too. Mm-hmm. So I think as they figure out how to come up with a expanded suite of services beyond Office 365 and Dynamics, and figure out how to make Windows lighter weight and cater to the developer a little bit, and then make that experience for the business apps and Azure kind of work together really, really well. Back to your analogy of how it didn't work, mm-hmm. I think there'll be innovation there, and they're incentivizing people tremendously, especially in the business space. Not so much the startup community, but in the business space, to really invest in Azure and the on-ramp for it and things of that nature. That's going to continue to grow that there. But I think the innovation is the breadth of services they're going to offer. Mm-hmm. And I think part of it they'll invent, part of it they'll acquire.
Mm-hmm. I keep thinking there's probably some weird marriage between, as much as I would dislike this personally, Google and Microsoft, where you have the Ubuntu, underlying underpinnings, operating system running. You could probably dovetail that and make it work with something like a Chrome OS or Android or whatever, and suddenly now you can run Android apps inside the Microsoft ecosystem. And I remember I was talking to one of the developers over there, and he's like, "There's no plans to do anything like that." And I'm like, "Yeah, yet." But when someone figures out that it's not a huge leap to go from Ubuntu to Android, you might think about that. So.
Yeah, it'll be interesting development. I just wonder if Microsoft's just been burned so many times on the device, whether they're just going to walk away. We lost that one.
I mean more like as a bridge between the two. So now you could finally start running your apps on Windows environments. So you could pull up your Android device, put it down, and suddenly those same apps are running in a Windows environment. So
yeah, I totally get it. That's actually a pretty innovative idea.
Thank you, sir.
I wonder if I wonder if some of them are thinking like that.
Well, you can tell Satya I told him so. So
sounds good.
So then you went on to AWS.
Uh-huh.
So tell me about that. What'd you do over there?
I started the database division of Amazon Web Services. Mm-hmm. So the first product was SimpleDB. And so it was the first database as a service product. We were trying to figure out, we knew it was also a little bit ahead of its time. To scale, Amazon had figured out that relational databases at a certain size, it's the index maintenance of maintaining a relational database that just kills you. It's the index maintenance and the writing and things of that nature. So you wind up denormalizing and just writing flat out big, large, smaller number of big vertical tables if we were going to, take cross section of it. And so then the other part is we knew we needed to, back to the CAP theorem. You can have consistency or availability in the face of a network partition because they happen all the time, but you can't have both. Which were you betting on? And we betted on eventual consistency. So you're going to have more of a columnar store, was the first one to do that. And it's going to have eventual consistency. Eventually you're going to see what you need. So you just pull. And we did that. And so it was pretty, and then a whole bunch of other things happened that nobody ever knew. Like we wrote the first self-healing distributed system based on gossip that scaled beyond 100 servers. We actually got it to scale to a massive size.
How would you describe the reason you decided to build this thing in the cloud? What got you down that path of why bother doing it in the first place?
Well, we when we were working on, we were debating what we wanted to call as cloud computing or utility computing. And so we had storage and we had an operating system, which was EC2. We knew like the third leg of the stool is we needed a database. That's kind of the core of everything that you build in an application. So we knew we had to build a database product. And we were looking at what it took to run Amazon.com, like I kind of rat-holed on previously. And so we said, hey, we need a database product. And from there, SimpleDB was born. But I was also, like I said, trying to describe, there's a lot of complexities. We made the API really, really simple. We made the developer experience really, really simple. But the complexities underneath, which is the core of the cloud, are actually quite complex. And so that's why we went after it to go do it.
And so you felt like you were in a unique position to do that because EC2 was coming online at the time? Like that was
EC2 was, EC2 and S3 was the first one to come online. Mm-hmm. Then EC2 was about a year earlier, maybe a year and a half earlier, and it was growing. But everybody's like, we need a database, we need a database, we need a database. And so we're working towards doing it, and SimpleDB was born.
And so what was the next one? Was that Redshift?
RDS.
RDS. Okay.
Relational Database Service. Like I said, it was a columnar database, what we built, but still it was still a little foreign to people. We just assumed because, hey, anybody at internet scale that's writing an internet app, they're going to figure out you have to denormalize and do all those things. That was foreign to a lot of people.
Yeah, especially newbie devs.
And so they wanted a relational database experience on it. And so that was when RDS was born.
And eventually Elasticsearch and Redshift came along. Is that after your time, or were you
Redshift kind of figured out that we needed Redshift and the design and business model? My time, but it was built after I left.
Gotcha. I mean, I've used a lot of those products, and extremely high performance. And we always debated, should we do it ourselves? I'm sure a lot of companies do this. It's like we could do this ourselves, and so we lose the support, but we also gain a lot of work. And we think we could do it better, but then we gain a lot of work, and so we never did. We never ended up building, we never built anything ourselves. It was all entirely the cloud-based version, the EC2, mix of Redshift and Elasticsearch. So it works. I mean, it absolutely runs a business for sure. One of my favorite things about Elasticsearch is that it runs and can actually search JSON. So similar to what you built all those years ago with XML search, allows you to search within JSON, which is really very, very
really
useful.
Powerful.
Extremely powerful.
Because JSON's now like the lingua franca of the internet.
Yeah, it really is. Or certainly turned that way. Much more than XML anyway. So I want to change the topic just a little bit, since now you're at AWS at this point in your career, and I think this is an interesting thing. I found this. It was an internal memo that was at from a Google employee who was previously an Amazon employee, And I don't know if you've read this thing, but it is a work of art.
I may have. If we cover it, it may pop.
Well, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read 2 sections of it because I think they're both hilarious. So first of all, he's talking about how Google could be better. It could be like Amazon. It's not like Amazon today, but it could be that way. So I'm just going to read these 2 quotes. I'm not even sure they're in order, but just so you get the drift. He didn't, referring to Bezos, and doesn't care even a tiny bit about the well-being of the teams, nor about what technologies they use, nor, in fact, any detail whatsoever about how they go about their business unless they happen to be screwing up. But Bezos realized long before the vast majority of Amazonians that Amazon needs to be a platform. So first of all, what's your reaction to that one?
100% true.
So I like the idea of everything being a platform because that means that you can pick it up and move it around. You can scale it. It's foreign enough to other applications that they don't have to worry about it. It's its own thing and it needs to be dealt with by itself.
But the number one thing about a platform is they're very sticky.
Mm-hmm.
Once you get it right and you're on the platform, switching costs are high.
Extremely high.
And when we were building AWS, one of the biggest things we were concerned about was switching costs. Like if they came onto us and hated us, how hard would it be to move? How simple we could make it to get onto AWS, but how hard was it going to be for somebody to move off of AWS? And when you're a platform vendor, that's kind of the ball game. Mm-hmm. Like you want to get them there and keep them there.
Yeah, like for instance, it's really easy to move data between instances or between S3 or whatever. Like it's basically free, but you move it outside of AWS and it's extremely expensive. Moving data in, inexpensive. Moving data out, very expensive. So
I wonder why that is.
Yeah, exactly. It's funny because I'm dealing with a very large Glacier array right now, and it's like dirt cheap. Like, yeah, you want to put a lot of data in our data center? Great. It'll cost you nothing. So, all right. So here's the second quote. His big mandate, in these capital letters, big mandate, went something along these lines. Number 1, all teams will henceforth expose their data and functionality through service interfaces. 2, the teams must communicate with each other through these interfaces. 3, there will be no other form of inter-process communications allowed. No direct linking, no direct reads of other teams' data store, no shared memory model, no backdoors whatsoever. The only communication allowed is via service interface calls over the network. It doesn't matter what technology they use. HTTP, Corba, PubSub, custom protocols, doesn't matter. Bezos doesn't care. Number 5, all service interfaces without exception must be designed from the ground up to be externizable. That is to say, the team must plan and design to be able to expose the interface to developers in the outside world, no exceptions. Number 6, anyone who doesn't do this will be fired. Number 7, thank you, have a nice day. Ha ha, you 150 odd ex-Amazon folks here will of course realize immediately that number 7 was a little joke I threw in because Bezos most definitely does not give a shit about your day.
I remember this whole thing.
So how does that strike you?
It's accurate.
Yeah.
Everything was built as a service in that day. There was, if you go back to Amazon retail, pre-AWS, there was the order service. There was the cart service. There was the catalog service. And so on and so forth through Amazon.com.
How culturally did that play out? Did people like that about it internally? Did they enjoy in that type of technology stack, or was
they liked so as a developer there were pros and cons. They liked the decentralized ownership model. Mm-hmm. I own my service, I scale my service, I design my service. The APIs, it became a dependency because there was no arbiter of who controls what version of an API that's out there. So if the order management service changed the orders API and cart now had to do that, it could slow cart down. So what one piece that was missing is like I'm talking about, like you had to have rules and a schema and the negotiation around it about how you manage versioning. Mm-hmm. So But the whole mandate of having it be an interface is 100% true.
Gotcha. And how about the part about Bezos not caring? Is that a real thing? Do you feel like
Jeff didn't get into technology? I mean, he would hire people around him that got into the technology. I would even say people on the S team, his directs, weren't too heavy in the technology. They would have their people they trusted, like any other senior person, that they would go off and do, and those people would inform them. So they might have what's called a shadow, and that shadow was their technology advisor. Jeff, you really need to pay attention to A, B, and C because this is important. And that's how he would glean insight into it. But he really didn't force mandates. And as a CEO, he probably shouldn't. That's not his role.
Yeah.
He had like a CTO, Werner, and who did and did not mandate stuff, but he did patrol around and influence things. Mm-hmm. But by and large, back to the decentralized teams management piece, what he did influence is what I described. Let's decentralize, give people control, allow them to move really, really fast, and try to build as little dependencies as possible between teams, which I thought was really smart.
Yeah, it seems like it, and certainly Google thought it was too. Otherwise, they wouldn't have started building things like GCP and building a lot of the similar types of technologies. I mean, it is smart. It's absolutely the right way to do it. And Microsoft agreed with Azure, and I think it sort of exploded the whole market in many ways.
Yeah. It was a big bet.
So the first mover advantage, you talked about this a little bit. Where do you think AWS really had that or secured it? Or is there a big enough moat? Do you think they're bound for the history books, or do you think that they will come out ahead? Like, who's going to win this big cloud computing war, do you think?
Well, you asked a multi-point question there.
Sure did.
So they absolutely wanted first mover advantage, and we talked about it all the time. Got to be first, got to be first, got to be first. We're willing to make trade-offs to kind of subterfuge how ready, how big, etc. to be ready, but we're absolutely at all costs going to be first with everything. And the premise was people always remember first. And I actually thought that was a stroke of genius because people do remember first, and they got the tinkerers, and that it incentivized the developer. They're like, well, Amazon's big. They've got this brand. They're making this available. They've run it on Amazon. I'll play with it. It's pretty simple. And they keep coming out with things on a regular basis. And there's more additive things. That changed the paradigm of computing, in my opinion, mm-hmm. is not only being first, but the regular pace of innovation, continuing on a good cadence, releasing new things.
So if they've built the three legs of the stool, what's next? What do you think they need to build that's not part of that stool that needs to be on there?
Well, we keep getting more value-added services. It's more than just compute and networking, so have they built first, so to back to your thing to answer that, Have they built first mover advantage? Absolutely. Has that propelled them to be the market leader? Absolutely. Is it an insurmountable moat? I don't know. It really depends. Over Google and IBM and Oracle, absolutely. They are just way too far behind. And we can debate their approach is way alien to the developer. It wasn't simple, wasn't easy, and all of that. Notwithstanding, they're going to be decent. There's decent enough money there for them to continue. The dark horse, the next one's going to be Microsoft, and we talked about that earlier in our presentation. Like, how can they tie all that together, and will that create a formidable thing there? And that's going to play itself out in the next few years. What's next in cloud? It's all around the value-added services to build the next generation of applications. We're now getting services to do OCR for AI. Mm-hmm. So.
That's exactly the example I was going to come up with.
Yeah, like 80% of internet traffic right now is video. All the kids on TikTok or whatever else it is. And so, but you need AI and that optical recognition to kind of start doing innovation around that. Well, now we're starting to get services around that.
Yeah.
And AR and VR, we can debate the metaverse. I'm not thinking it's going to be a big deal, but that's just one man's opinion. But I think AR and VR will be. And I think that's the bridge to whatever the metaverse ultimately becomes. Well, there's now services to do that. Cloud augmented reality, pushing the processing here and between the edge to do that. And I think the distributed nature of computing with edge and what you push into the data center is going to blossom a whole new set of applications that come out.
It certainly makes a lot of sense that burst compute, like you don't really need these incredibly heavy processes to run all the time. You need them to run in batches. So just run it whenever you have time to run it. And so I want the cheapest option. Oh, it turns out it runs at 4:00 in the afternoon. Fine, whatever. Just run it. I just need it done. And that's perfect because I think that's one of the things that's underutilized about EC2 is the ability to run things in the cheapest way you possibly can. And there's entire services around this. I just want it to run at some point. Well, what if we need to pull it back? Well, then the batch doesn't complete and you lost this amount of money and you just run it again when it has time again. Fine. It's as long as your code is resilient enough, you can definitely make a lot of money, save a lot of money in the process of doing that.
Yeah, I think things like edge, another one to pay attention to is quantum. Quantum computing has a lot of potential uses. I mean, we can all look about cryptographic keys. That's the one obvious use case that everybody can wrap their head around. An uncrackable key, or the converse. I've got a quantum guy sitting there trying to crack every key. Mm-hmm. That's one. The paradigm issues from metallurgy to electronic design to medicine modeling, all of that, and just we're way early days on it. But the applicable things that you can do with quantum, once they make the programming model not have to be an astrophysicist to program, quantum's a big one to come out. And AWS is starting to come out with quantum services. So it's the value-added services and the continued value-added services that are beyond just the three-legged stool, and the pace at which those come out is going to be there.
So I totally agree. Back to the AI thing, I really think, it's not just OCR. There's so many applications for AI. It's kind of impossible to enumerate even just a small fraction of them, but anything from, I just need to know some signal from this crazy amount of noise, and I'm just going to pump in an enormous amount of data. And I have this algorithm runs across it. It's like, oh, great. There's some things I should possibly look at. There's no way that makes sense to run on a desktop environment or in a personal compute environment or whatever. You're talking about something you're only going to have to run once or maybe once a year or something. It's a very rare event. Why bother spinning up all this physical infrastructure? You have the cloud right there. It's already well suited for this type of task.
Serverless.
Yeah, serverless compute. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And the idea that I can run these microservices that only run for a split second, like I need to run this thing and I just need the data back. I don't care about the operating system. I don't care about the patch levels. I don't care about the networking stack. I don't want it to boot. I just want to run something and come back with the data. That's hugely valuable. So,
and the AI piece, there's something that generative AI. What happens if you don't have to write much code anymore? Mm-hmm. What happens if AI was watching what you're doing? We have Grammarly today, and I use Grammarly because I'm a horrible typer. Well, developers in general are not the greatest typers. What happens if generative AI came out and it was pretty good at writing code? That revolutionizes things quite a bit, don't you think? About speed and agility in the development process. We're a ways away because you have to get the things there, but in the next 3 to 5 years, could it become really, in the next 3 years, could it become really realistic? Absolutely. Talk about changing the game a little bit. That one's there.
Yeah. So we've seen things go from, mainframes, centralized big shared compute to local desktop environments to out to, services, call it, SaaS software, back to now it's running on mobile, then it's all, out in the cloud. And now we're kind of back to maybe we should be able to just have more compute on your personal compute device and actually run AI right here. Why are you sending this off into the cloud? Because a lot of people don't want the sensitive information to leave their device. Like, where do you think we sort of land? Do you think it's always going to be hybrid? Do you think we're going to like land on one model where it's the mobile phone or desktop environment's a thin client compared to this very complex infrastructure? Or do you think it's going to be kind of a mix? Where do you think it's going to land?
That's a multi-part too. Mm-hmm. I think computing is becoming distributed. And so let's work back from the device. So you're going to have rich devices, our phones, or a sensor that's working in an oil field that's tracking viscosity of oil through a pipe, or that's tracking the traversing of a vehicle down a river, to medical equipment that's tracking our health, to cameras, to vehicles, connected vehicles, to kids watching pixelated video that's no longer pixelated, so you're going to have a spectrum of devices, right? Why hasn't that materialized right now? Because of connectivity. So, what's the statistics? Every 3 years, the raw number of connected devices doubles. We slowed down because of the pandemic, the pandemic blame. But why? Because of the chip shortage. That's going to accelerate. And so now we also have 5G. And the premise of 5G isn't just, now you can do, before you could do, I think what the statistics was about 1 million or a couple million. I'll have to go back to it, but you could have the potential for 3 billion devices in the New York metropolitan area really, really soon. You couldn't do that on 4G. Now with 5G, you can. And has a broader spectrum. So as it goes out into rural areas. So what does that open up? It opens up a lot of use cases on devices. Mm-hmm. Great. So some devices are going to be rich. Some devices are going to be not rich. They're all going to need connectivity. Now, you're going to need something in the middle, like a mesh network. That's where edge computing comes in, because we're not going to be able to send it because they're going to want a responsive experience. We're not going to be able to send it all as fast as they can build data centers. You can't send it all back to a distributed, to a centralized cloud data center to process everything just because of the bandwidth problem. There's only so much bandwidth they can produce. So that necessitates putting some frontline processing. You talked about AI. Do some initial OCR on a video that you're seeing, and then send the heavy data for processing on back to a centralized cloud. And that centralized cloud's in a region that satisfies the privacy laws that you have, mm-hmm. right? I think that's the model that computing is going to be. You're going to have a wide spectrum of different device types. You're going to have mesh in different metropolitan areas of different devices, and that's materializing now. And then you're going to have cloud or physical data centers in those regions to satisfy the privacy laws.
Mm-hmm. One thing I have not seen yet any of these device manufacturers go down the path of is saying you can run your own. Like we'll create whatever Apple's infrastructure in a box, and you can just throw it in your network. It'll be yours, fully encrypted. You're the only one with the keys to it. Drop it in the mud puddle, it's dead. That kind of thing. It seems like there could be a market for it's in the cloud, but it's your cloud. It's your personal cloud. Because I think a lot of people are starting to get a little nervous about how much data is being mined by these very large companies. And it would be nice to have some alternative.
Well, the IEEE there's the IEEE just released a paper in the last 2 days about making identity and your privacy of your data decentralized, so that the end user controls through a paradigm. They control their identity and how their personalized their personal information is shared with a processor. Mm-hmm. That's the mode that is going to happen. So you talked about the Microsoft Live paradigm, right? Two-factor auth and everything. there's really a small number of identity providers out there. And they all want it because they know all the information about you and they can sell insidious ads. That's really all it's for.
Yep.
What happens if you could turn the paradigm over and you, as the end user, could choose, I control my identity and I can control what I share with you, and it's my choice to do that.
Yep.
And the IEEE has a whole working group on that and just released their first paper on doing that. Now, there's going to be some wars on that with the obvious players because they're not as incentivized to see something like that work, but that is the direction that it's going to go.
See, this is actually where some local storage and local AI is actually not a terrible idea, because you can actually push just a bulk amount of ads down and the person's phone can say, hey, this is the kind of person they are. I'll show them these ads, but the people who sent me the ads have no idea if I'm ever going to see them or not. It's never known to anybody really other than me, because I'm the one who saw it. And if I decide to click on the ad and go to somewhere, obviously the advertiser who sent me the ad gets to know about it, but that's it. Or maybe a centralized authority gets to know that an ad was clicked, so to charge so-and-so a right amount of money, but that would literally be the only time. So I think there is some interesting hybrid models out there. And I've heard of this idea before. Another friend of mine talked about it many, many, many years ago. It's like, he's like, I would like to go to a website and say, I'm okay giving up my email address, but I'm not okay giving my whatever address, or, I'd be okay telling you like these parts of my demographics, or I'm okay telling you these interests, but not my demographics or whatever. And if you want it, I'll sell it to you. I'll sell it to you for some amount of money, like $1 or something. So if you really, really want it, you can pay me $1 through some transactional interface or whatever. And I don't even notice it's really happening. It's just
an interesting model.
I know, right? It is an interesting model. And I think a lot of people would like that. It's like, well, I want none of this, but if I'm a wealthy person and I really don't want my privacy invaded, maybe it's $20, $100, $1,000, and then who cares? You're just, it costs exactly what they're willing to pay for it. So the market ends up normalizing itself. And so I don't know, kind of interesting idea. So eventually you went on to be the CTO of Parallels. Tell me all about that.
Yeah. So Parallels at the time, we were famous for running Windows on the Mac virtualization, running Windows.
Was this a stealth project from Microsoft? Where you're like, go over there and help build it?
No. It was, that's what they were famous for. But the stealth project, that was like the cash cow. That's where we made margins. But what the bigger one was server-side containers. We built the first commercial version of containers technology. It's called Virtuoso. And it was built for the hosting market. It was all about trying to get density for hosters. And I was trying to push us to kind of make it a little more simple, because I knew the problem coming from Amazon. Like, that's where the ball game was won on EC2. It was all about density and doing it cost effectively. And we could go on and on and on about that. How many virtual instances you pack on the box. And they could run higher because VMs, you virtualize the hardware. In a container, you virtualize the operating system and you clone that. And so it was figuring out how to make that more reliable, etc., and try to make it simpler. And that's kind of why I went there, I'm like, I saw this as an angle to really go.
Mm-hmm. So out of curiosity, So is this before? This got to be before OpenStack came around, right?
It was before OpenStack came around.
So how did they see OpenStack? I mean,
OpenStack was driven by Rackspace, who was one of their customers because of the hosting part of.
Yeah. Was that an existential threat, or how did you guys perceive that?
When OpenStack first came out, it was something we wanted to monitor, but viewed it as more of something that was just something to monitor and not something to take like super serious. The challenge with Parallels was the founders were tired and they wanted to sell. And so we got into the paradigm of, well, virtualization has been commoditized. There's all the different open sources and they're winning, VMware and Microsoft Hyper-V, and then you have all the three different flavors of open source, it's commoditized. We're not going to win, even though we had a different way to go about it. And so we ultimately sold.
Mm-hmm. I remember working at Sybase after they bought Cable and Wireless America, which bought Exodus, which bought Digital Island, and that's how I got involved in that. This is a long chain of companies. And they were very, very forward thinking. They eventually got bought by CenturyLink. So CenturyLink's entire backend is effectively the same stuff I built years and years and years ago. But I know this is going to seem extremely obvious to you, but maybe not everyone listening. Like, the entire concept was we have a whole bunch of machines, but we don't necessarily use all of these machines all the same time, or we might burst up or down. Or like I used to work at eBay, for instance. Oftentimes the systems are completely overloaded and everyone's crushing the system trying to get stuff at auction or whatever. But those are certain hours of the day. And then there's a whole other chunk of the day when there's a lot less going on. So why not run the batch job? Well, why do we need a whole separate set of machines for that? Why not run it on the same machines, just spin down the machines that are doing the front end stuff and then spin up the ones that do the back end batch jobs? And you can greatly reduce the amount of cost and load. And so what, from your perspective, like how did things like Docker come around, and like how did this evolve and change sort of the industry? Like, how did you see people talking about it before and after?
At first it was the density problem you're talking about. Mm-hmm. And it was like, how many of these, a server's like a jar. How many rocks, pebbles, and sand can I get in my jar? And that's what the discussion was about, because CIOs and CTOs were all like, save me money, save me money, save me money. How did Docker come about? Well, once they started getting all those on, I'm a heavily packed jar. Now I've got to move stuff because the jar breaks. And so now I've got to have some level of movement because that breaks and I have to have some fault tolerance. And so I need orchestration, right? I need something to move me from one jar to another. And then the other thing they started to look at where Docker came out is about the application. Like when you start making orchestration, you had to do some kind of unnatural things to the application to get it to work. Well, where Docker came in was like, I'm going to make it really simple to take just an image of your app with some configuration. And I've got this orchestration thing, and then I'm going to be able to clone your app and run it in multiple places and make it really, really simple to go that route.
Even multiple data centers.
And when they came out with that way, like the foundations had to be built in the order we came up with, and the pain had to be felt by the adopters once they did it. But again, where these platforms really take off is when you attract the developer. We talked about the phone, we've talked about the cloud, now we're talking about this. When you won the minds of developers, people want productivity out of the developer. They want simple, easy, frictionless infrastructure because it's cost. Once you tied all those things together, magic starts happening. And that's where Docker came in and kind of turned it upside down and brought it all together. Mm-hmm. And that's how it won.
Docker plus Kubernetes. I think those two those are the peas and carrots that go, the orchestration you're talking about.
Yeah.
So we've moved into an interesting place now where we have not just virtualization like in the server sense, we have virtualization literally even in the browser. Like virtualization is everywhere now. It's like this thing that we thought was just going to be about putting marbles in jars is now about isolation. It's about protecting data from moving one place to another. And if something crashes, it only takes itself out. It doesn't take out the entire thing. Like this has grown a lot since the early days.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing I thought was kind of interesting is a friend of mine was building an app, and every single component was built in a Google environment using effectively workers and microservices. And I was asking him like, well, explain your database schema, explain this, explain that, and what kind of operating systems and blah, blah. He's like, I don't have any of those things. I don't know. He's like, it was kind of foreign to him. Like, I don't really think about things like that. I don't have any of those things. And like, he literally does not have, user roles. Like there's no place to log in with regard to his server environment, like all of that's changing. And, I know that there's ways to build workers inside, like Cloudflare, for instance, where you effectively can run an entire extremely complex dynamic application, as long as you're okay not having like a backend database entirely on workers. So where do you think that is all going? Do you have any opinions on the future of the sort of the front end version of cloud-based processing and virtualization?
Well, like you mean from the browser on down?
Everywhere, all over it. Do you think I'm going to have it in my phone where I can just swipe and be in Android and swipe again and be in?
I don't think.
How far is this going to go?
I don't think we'll get there. I think the paradigm that you described that was interesting is, having isolation, some level of isolation. And that really depends on how many different applications are going to run on the end device and how rich they are and how to isolate them. That's an interesting paradigm, and that's what's going to dictate it. And so I really haven't thought deeply enough about it to really give you a coherent answer.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's fair enough. I'm pretty interested to see how far these front-end proxy servers like Cloudflare, like Akamai, Imperva, cloud-based web application firewalls, and CDNs can take this idea. It's like, well, why do you really need to think about databases the way you've thought about them? Just think about them as JSON blobs, and we'll take care of the rest.
Well, I actually think, do you mind if I interrupt?
Of course.
Yeah, I actually think the role of the CDN is back to the distributed part and the edge computing, right? So now I've got the top of the pyramid. You always think of things as cakes. So the icing is the number of devices that I have, and we talked about that. Then the middle, the next layer down is that mesh of processing. So now what's a content distribution network great at? Distributing things with low latency repeatedly. So if I'm in Austin right now, you can't build a lot of data centers in Austin. Why? Because it's power. So you're going to have a lot of micro data centers all over Austin. Hotels are going to have them. Every little Chick-fil-A around here's got a little cabinet running in it. All that kind of stuff. How do you distribute the application and the APIs that are the bridge between the devices running in my Chick-fil-A or out my metropolitan area to how it gets coalesced and processed and sent back through the cloud data center? I need a CDN-ish kind of thing because they're really good at distributing that kind of stuff. I distribute my APIs. I distribute the AI processing. I distribute all the ML processing, the lightweight ML processing, not the stuff that does the heavy stuff. And CDNs like that are really good at distributing that out to a different kind of paradigm. So the mesh that will become the edge endpoints could be distributed and processed through a CDN. And I think that's a cogent model that could emerge.
I keep thinking that they're sort of eating the world, and eventually they're just going to say, you know what, why don't you just also run all your apps inside Cloudflare or Akamai or whatever? Like, why even allow AWS to exist? Just start eating that market share, piece by piece, until eventually one of two things happens. Either Amazon has to buy them, or they have to start competing in that world and start building their own CDNs. And to some extent, I think they're kind of already in that business. I mean, with S3, they're basically doing very similar things, big JSON blobs living in the cloud or whatever. And they already have the concept of load balancing. So they're right there. They just haven't made it productized, It's like all the Tinker toys are there. They just haven't put them together.
Yeah. If you can build the way to distribute back to the developer, make the developer's life easier, distribute the APIs, give them tools to manage it, give them tools to operate it, give it tools to administer it, and distribute it in a way. But I don't think the cloud's going to go away. And why? There's some heavy duty processing that's just, it always exists. There's only so much you can do. And we have the privacy thing, which is just going to continue to expand. We're going to have more and more privacy laws. So you're going to distribute to provide that snappy experience, low latency, highly reliable. And it's going to have more and more processing to a point, and it's going to hit a wall, and then it's going to have to send to somewhere. Mm-hmm. So the CDN is going to be exactly that, the distribution of that area, and it'll become more and more powerful. But I still think the role of the cloud data center or the hyperscaler big data center for those that want to hold and control their own is going to be around for a long time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I keep thinking that there's a role for data centers in a box where you just say, hey, I just need you to roll up with a big tractor trailer, drop it off. It's got its own generator in there. It works. It does everything. And I just I need 5 of them. Fine. Just click them all together. And
they've got it now. Yeah. I went to a conference here in Austin called Data Cloud, and I was invited to speak about edge computing. Because I write articles about edge because I actually think that's an untapped thing that's going to change. There are things that unlocks we haven't even thought about yet. And what I took away that I didn't realize is many of the largest data center providers are doing precisely what you just described. I want a couple racks here, want a couple racks there, want 5 racks, want this, and I want it in this thing. And I want to put it on the roof of my hotel, or I want to put it in the back office of the Chick-fil-A, or I want to put it in my oil pump, and everywhere in between. But I want it, and the reason why it's very appealing to them is it's lightweight. It doesn't consume a lot of power. The heating and cooling is low. I can expand more readily across like our Austin metropolitan area rather than sending everything to a data center, which we've already described. There's limited real estate, limited power, etc. Mm-hmm. And they're all working on it. It's really, really interesting.
Yeah, one of the things I've been thinking about for a while is, let's say you're like driving a Humvee or something out in Afghanistan or whatever, and let's say something starts going weird in your vehicle, the car started to shake or whatever, it's like seriously something wrong with this vehicle. We can all feel it, it's happening. So what is your option? Well, your option is send this enormous data burst of every single thing wrong with this that could possibly be wrong with this vehicle over a satellite link, which just sounds like an enormous waste of bandwidth, power, processing all this stuff. And hope that it gets there, and then hope that someone figures out what's wrong with it and then sends back some telemetry back down to, by that point I'm back to my base or whatever. And there's just so much wrong with that it just seems like it's untenable. Not to mention the fact that the alternative is even worse, is like, okay, well, we're just going to store all this data local to the device, local to this Humvee. But meanwhile, it gets attacked, and now you have an exact map of exactly where this Humvee has been over whatever lifespan that thing's got its data packet. So it seems like there's a role for this middle ground. And if you think about it, like just like a cell phone or anything else, like there's kind of this middle ground where it's like you don't need the entire data packet. You really just need the 1 or 2 sensors that are obviously saying through a local AI on the inside the Humvee, hey, we're acting weird. So you send that tiny data packet over the cellular connection or whatever, satellite or whatever. And the big mama bird says, hey, I've looked at all Humvees everywhere throughout all of history, and I can tell it's probably one of 3 problems. So I'd like these 3 sensors to report back over this time slice. So it sends it back to the Humvee, which takes a while, but whatever. And the Humvee says, okay, here's the 3. It's like, aha, your transaxle's going out, or, you got a low flat left tire or whatever. You got to go fix that. So it's a much faster diagnosis. Meanwhile, all the data aboard just gets encrypted. So if you go and blow it up with a mine or whatever and extract the device, you just got a big encrypted blob that's not worth anything until you take it all the way back to the base. So I think there's room for like AI plus compression plus using the cloud for these very large data sets when it makes sense, shipping large drives of data, sort of like the Amazon Glacier sort of model, where you're going to do these large scale batch job analysis, trending analysis over long periods of time across every single thing that's ever gone wrong with every device. And so you get the best of all of the worlds, where you get the local immediate reaction that you need, plus this long tail of the enormous amount of data that would not make any sense to transmit over the public internet like that. So what do you think? Is that?
I think that's a class of device that's out there, thinking our distributed model. I actually think that is a class of device, and the industrial internet's the same way. If I have these big machines in an industrial factory, they're not going to want to send every diagnostic of every sensor on a big machine, but they'll want to send a subset, and I'm going to have some processing there. And furthermore, the latency of sending it, even if we had it distributed close, there is, like you described, the latency of, I need to react to this so quickly that I can't send everything back, even if it's to something in the same city. I can't afford that latency to do it. So I need some level of processing right where I'm at to do it. And I think there is a class. You called out the Humvee example. I think there's others for sure.
Yeah. I mean, well, even consumer class versions of these same things, like a Tesla, let's say, there's really no reason that I should be phoning home all the time about every single piece of data that you could possibly ever collect on a Tesla. That's just wildly way too much data.
Because they want you to pay your subscription, and if you don't pay, they'll lock you out of your car.
But fundamentally, I mean, think about what your car is doing all day long, especially a self-driving car. It's basically got LiDAR or camera array around all of the corners of your car all day long. That's terabytes of data. You're not going to be transmitting that over cellular. You're not. But, to be honest, it's not that crazy to be transmitting terabytes of data or subsections of that terabytes of data when it comes home and it's just sitting there in the garage. That's not insane. You could theoretically do that. It would be annoying maybe here and there. So you could pick and choose and make it a little bit smarter, but that's, but I would want my Tesla or whatever device I was driving in to say, hey, I'm seeing something wrong with this car. It's acting, I push the throttle and it's not going, or I push the throttle and I take it off and it's still going or whatever. There's something happening with this vehicle that's outside the normal parameters.
Yeah.
So after all this, you temporarily retired. And
I went to Rackspace and then another company.
You went to Rackspace. Okay. So I didn't realize that. So you actually were familiar with OpenStack up close and personal.
Yep.
So what happened? Rackspace kind of imploded. Was that on your watch or was that much later?
No, it was much later.
Okay.
What happened? Late to the game a little bit, had mind share. Figuring out, is it a distro like another Linux, or is it a thing all of its own? How do you how do you win on this? If you're going to build a bunch of open source clouds, and how are you going to win the developer? Well, you got to make it frictionless, right? And that's the portability. Remember, you described, make it easy, that the AWS Roach Motel. It's easy to get in, but you can't get out. Mm-hmm. Like now we're building all these, sorry for that analogy. I'm sure someone at Amazon's going to be mad at me. So now I'm building out all these OpenStack sites. It was changing so fast. The design of OpenStack was just moving so fast. Like when we were engineering that and launched the public cloud, we had determined that if we fell behind, more than 2 weeks of the main line, we would never catch up.
Wow.
And we were deploying on tens of thousands of servers. So we had to build this whole automation framework to ensure we never fell behind in our entire pipeline from the time we downloaded it till we changed it till we got back in.
And you had a point there where you actually had to shut down people's computers to update them, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. How did that go?
Well, I was a bad guy and said no more zero downtime deployments. Had to do that. But, back to the paradigm of what you asked, like everybody's building an OpenStack thing, but how do they differentiate? But then how do you out Amazon and out Azure? You build a bunch of and expand quickly and have the similar API and similar experience across all these different things, plus some special sauce that makes HP or Dell or all these other things valuable on it. And never could quite figure that out. And I think that is what hurt OpenStack.
So this is like the fourth or fifth time I've heard this story, just a different technology, but the same story. Like we used open source, we built this thing, but eventually they update that thing, and now we have to update that thing. So we're always beholden to whoever's actually maintaining the open source thing. And you're never really getting ahead of it because you're always struggling just to do what you're currently doing and update. So you can never really get ahead, and eventually you fall behind, or if you don't fall behind, that's all you're just struggling constantly to keep up. So you can never really innovate on top of the open source project that you're talking about. So, I mean, I think a lot of people get very upset by this implication, but would you recommend running a company on open source based on that knowledge?
Yes, I would. I would recommend and have run multiple companies on open source. Here's a couple qualifiers for you. How much is the project changing for the paradigm you just described? Like, how much maintenance am I going to take on by taking on that?
Well,
technology?
let's say something like Chrome, or an operating system like Ubuntu, or something like OpenStack, like very large projects. Would you recommend that?
Again, it depends on how frequently it's changing. Ubuntu, fine. OpenStack, like we talked about, that's a very large and complex thing that changed really, really quickly and really, really frequently. Ubuntu doesn't change that quickly and frequently now. Why? Because it's later in its life cycle. OpenStack wasn't. So how frequently is it going to change? The second thing is do you have an idea how long it's going to be around? You know, you get a lot of developers excited about open source projects because it's new, it's cool, and I want to be involved. And then you figure out at some point they die down, and that usually happens in the 12 to 18 month time frame. After 12 to 18 months, you're going to figure out whether that open source project has legs or not. And so do you want to take that on? You brought up Kubernetes. You know, I was on a company and we started on Kubernetes 0.7, and then there was the Docker Swarm, and then there was Apache's orchestration thing, and they were all going neck and neck. And everybody thought, well, Google will win because it's Google. Well, you know, Google's not the most famous success for open source either. But in the early days, they were iterating quickly, and there was a lot of churn. And it wasn't so clear it was going to be around. We made a bet, and we analyzed it, and we stuck with Kubernetes as our orchestration thing. But it took a while to vet. But it took a while to vet, and we looked around the energy around it. Like I said, that's the whole ball of wax. Like, how fast moving is it? How many releases are happening in what succession? How many developers are on it? And what's its life cycle, and how long has it been around? You know, what's the energy? Mm-hmm. I mean, look, a huge portion of the internet is built on open source.
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, your phone, if you're using
Android,
if you're Android or Apple, I mean, Apple's based on FreeBSD. So, okay, so let's phrase it in a different way. Where would you not build a company? What if you looked at an open source project and like, this is the hallmark of a company that should not be built on top of this product? Well, basically I want to hear the opposite version of what you just said. If you were like, this project meets these requirements, therefore we gotta, you know, it's something that's got no energy behind it, or it's something that's bound to be replaced by something else, or there's just way too much movement in it. It's going to change too quickly. We're never going to be able to keep up. Like,
those are, so are you looking for qualifiers like that, or specific product examples?
That would be great if you had them, but just generally, like if you look at an open source project, you're like, that is the hallmark of a particular project that would be dangerous to build a company on top of.
Here's another one, UI. So we're now going through in Python, for example, there's oodles of Python apps, oodles. Do I go with a thin framework, or do I go with a more thick framework? And people are going back and forth. Why? And there's the thick framework's been around a lot longer. There's a lot more developers to hire, but it's got some warts. It doesn't perform as well. It doesn't scale as well, etc. So people are like, hey, because of that, I need more control. So I got to write more code. So I need a thinner framework. There's how many? 5 now? Which one's going to win? Back to those criteria, right? Another one, so the breadth of choice. Another one is, how do you hire for it? Like if you're going to go look and you pick up a specialized one that's kind of nascent, you're making a bet, how readily are you able to hire someone to operate it, maintain it, etc.? Because that places a risk on your entire organization, that specialization.
Yeah.
And so that's another one to take into account. Whether it's a DevOps engineer or a developer or however you want to look at it, they're all equally important. But if you put single points of failure like that in there, that's a key consideration, because if they go do it and they leave, or all the myriad of reasons we have attrition, now what do you do?
I like that one. That actually dovetails very closely with something I've been working on with regards to M&A. So it turns out you can kind of tell from the public internet if this company is going to be a good fit, because you can say, well, they're running a bunch of whatever, Drupal stuff. Okay, we're looking around your organization, like, who knows Drupal? Literally nobody? Okay, well, that's not going to work very well. Or at minimum, we're going to have to really incentivize that Drupal team to stay aboard, because we have nobody who can handle this internally. We're going to have to hire for it. And so we got to treat those guys in particular extremely, extremely well. So I totally get and agree with what you're saying. What about licensing, like GNU?
That's another one, is how important is the licensing to you or not? It becomes more important for bigger companies, I think, or ones where regulatory compliance are important, or et cetera, because they're bigger targets. Smaller companies aren't as worried about that. It's just the name of the game. Mm-hmm. But for bigger companies, like you talked about, the different licensing agreements, that does play a role.
Or if you want to get acquired by one of those big companies.
Right.
Yeah, then it becomes very, very important. Okay, so why did you end up leaving?
One was the travel. I had hundreds of employees in 5 cities, and I was raising young kids, and one of them had health issues. My wife said, "You don't need you at home." So that was the big driver. And so went to a smaller company, and it worked out.
Mm-hmm. So, and then you eventually retired and moved to Mexico.
No, I retired, and I built, while I was still working, my wife and I built a vacation home in Mexico. But when I retired, my wife's like, now's the perfect time to go get your permanent residency, because there's benefits of being a property owner down there. We're both eventually going to get our permanent residency. And so I went down there at month 1 of retirement. I thought I was going to be there 3 weeks, and I wound up having to stay 2 months. Mm-hmm. And so went down to Mexico. Oh, darn. Mm-hmm. But my wife was amazing about it, and she took care of our teenagers while I did that.
Mm-hmm. She didn't come down to visit you?
She did come down to visit after a while, after they got out of school. I went in April, and they came down in June, and the immigration people, it's coming in 2 days. It's coming in 2 days. And when they ran out of blanks, and all the cards had to be made in Mexico City. Well, they ran out of blanks, so they couldn't stamp new cards. And then they only had one machine in the whole country to make permanent residence cards. And then, who would have thought this? Or they were just, yanking my chains. I don't know whichever one it was.
You just forgot to grease the wheels.
But it just perpetually moved along. But it was cool. I got to spend time at my beach house.
Yeah. So what do you think of Mexico, living there?
I think it's fine. Look, do those things that you read about in the papers happen? Yes. Have I seen it in my area? No. I'm not in a super touristy area. I'm in a local beach at near a big metropolitan area, but not in it. It's not highly trafficked. I'm pretty low key. Like, I don't come down wearing Prada, or Prada. My wife's not wearing Louis. we're not driving big cars there. Don't wear flashy jewelry. In general, don't draw attention to yourself. Have a good time. Just relax, and you'll by and large be fine.
Interesting.
The Mexican people are generally family oriented. They want to help you. If you try to speak Spanish, they're gonna help you. They generally like to have fun. So if you like joke around a little bit, everything, they generally will engage with you, and they want to be treated with respect.
No, who doesn't?
Yeah, exactly. And I think people get a bad rap. Now, are there bad elements there? Yeah, there's bad elements here in Austin, Texas too, right? So that's my view.
Yeah, for sure. And if after a while you'll get a sense of where they are and where to how to avoid them. And so, have you encountered anything noteworthy? No, it's just it's been all just vacation for you.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Good. All right, so then you decided to get back into the game. You're like, I'm bored sitting on the beach, which, by the way, is a very common affliction. A lot of people are like, oh, when I get enough money, I'm just going to go retire on the beach. Well, that lasts a while, and then they just like, I got to get back out there. I'm gonna get bored. I just can't do this. Was that your experience? Did you say?
Yeah, it was kind of. It's a great question. So yeah, it was kind of like month 3 of my residency. I could get used to it. I'm not beating to somebody else, marching to somebody else's drum. This is great. Month 6, I'm like, I'm just going to do a little bit of stuff to keep my head going, because I need head candy. It's how I'm wired. And I like to do things, but I like to golf. I like to golf every once in a while, but I don't want to spend every day on the 19th hole saucing it up. And a lot of people do. That's just not my thing. So a friend pulled me into a consulting arrangement, and we helped a company, and he's like, hey, I can need your help. And I helped create the strategic technology plan for a pretty large company that was born out of a collection of acquisitions, and really enjoyed it. And it was part-time. So I didn't have to work mega hours, and it was pretty flexible. So I was like,
and you didn't have to travel and all that stuff.
I didn't have to. I traveled a little bit, but not great. And keep in mind, this is right before the pandemic. So I was like, hey, I think I could do this. So in January of 2020, I hung my shingle out.
Perfect timing.
Perfect timing. Well, actually it worked out.
I know. But
so I started marketing myself to do this consulting, and it worked out. So FifthVantage was born.
FifthVantage. What's the name mean?
5-star advantage. Our company tagline is, we offer expertise. Our expertise is your advantage.
Okay.
And so it's really about like, we have the expertise. It's all, we build Amazon. We built big products at Microsoft. We built big products at Rackspace. We have taken them from their ground up to very large size. Along the way, we've learned what to do, but more importantly, what no one talks about is we learned what not to do. And that's even more important. And so it's about sharing that expertise.
So you mentioned to me over the phone that you do a lot of like business transformations, like taking people from X to Y. What does that look like?
Well, one, for example, we helped a cyber company. They used to sell $1 million worth of their software and a rack of hardware to every one of their customers. And they knew, they weren't going to be able to scale distribution wise to accomplish all their revenue goals with that much of an investment up front. So helped them redesign the entire product to SaaS. So how to redesign it, how to architect for cloud native, what they write versus what's in AWS, how to reorient their processes. So all about digital engineering, how to iterate a new product as quickly as possible, all your releases, etc., how to structure the organization for that rapid delivery, how to merge from the old to the new. And they were successful with all of our recommendations after a year and went public. Helped other companies with their growth paradigm. I'm helping a company. I'm now the technical advisor for. They're in Africa. Wonderful, great guys. Super smart, super humble. Love the mission. They're digitizing the supply chain in Africa.
Interesting.
So most of commerce happens in the big cities in Africa, and it's through the smaller retailers. Well, the big suppliers, think Coke, Pepsi, they don't have a way to get into those stores. And so they have figured out a paradigm to get the smaller retailers from the point of sale into a micro distribution center locally to the big suppliers to float Coke and Pepsi, for example, into those. And so been helping them with everything, like how to scale the org, who you hire, what's your processes, how you design AWS versus your own, all that kind of stuff. So
is this the playbook you were talking about? So talk about that. Like how do you bring someone through that process?
Yeah, well, have a playbook of kind of what works and what doesn't about, like we talked about, like your open source question. Like, how do you pick technologies? And so one of them is it's a data-driven exercise. It always is. Typically where people do it is a developer super passionate and they like it and they write code and people weren't paying attention and all of a sudden becomes production critical and it's in there. But it's not about a data-driven exercise. Take the time up front, like write out your objective criteria of your decision making, then get hands-on and prototype it, and then make your decision. So that's one kind of thing, is a decision-making matrix is one kind of thing. Another thing is the processes that you have to take to try to like get your code out faster. So I call it the code to value metric. From the time a developer writes their line of code till the time it's out in production, what is that time? Where are you spending all that time in that pipeline? Work backwards from there till the time it's out in production. And then how do you reduce through automation processes, tools, people, a methodical way to make that reduce that time frame? And so that's really about best practices and all the things I talked about. The other thing is writing the balance of what you leverage in AWS versus you write in your own code. Have a playbook. We talked about platforms. How important is that technology that you own in case it fails versus whether you write in your own code? What's the cost? That's the evil thing no one ever talks about. Mm-hmm. It's a math problem. Absolutely. You have to have a spreadsheet that you math out. You write the math, the calculus to map out the costs. How much time and people does it cost you to write your own software to do this versus what it goes on AWS? And how does that change in 1 year, 3 years, and 5 years? What's the calculus around that? And things of that nature. So playbooks around choosing technologies, operating technologies, structuring an org, the processes you make, and around making decisions. That's really the playbook I've built up over the last 30 years.
Out of curiosity, how do you feel about technical debt? I mean, first of all, should you have it, or should you try to get rid of it right away? Or should you have a plan for maybe a year or 2 years down the line, like you're going to have to refactor your code, get to version 2, just plan to have to rewrite every single inch of this code? Because that's not necessarily a bad thing, because as we all know, the second time you write something, it's usually better. Like, how do you telegraph how to deal with technical debt?
Okay. So first off, everybody has junk in the trunk. That's what I call it. There's no software project that doesn't have it. The question is how'd you get there? So you can solve that problem by planning your strategic investments. Where are you investing in and why? How often you invest in it, and what's the cadence that you invest in it? So I'm kind of writing a blog about one topic. One topic is, hey, from over a certain period, let's call it a quarter, how much do I invest in technical debt versus features? Where you're always going to have technical debt where it blows up on you if it's always all about the features. In general, if things are going smoothly, you have some debt, you have features, but things are by and large operating well, and you have a clear line of sight to, for 12 months, you don't think you have to make big investments. Should be 70% features, 30% debt. You're taking on features, and you're also taking on some of the debt. So you're balancing it. If it's 90% features and 10% debt, that rooster's always going to come to roost at some point, and the pendulum's going to have to swing, where it's going to be no features for a while or 10% features, and I'm going to have take on debt.
Just to be clear, what you mean is 70% new features and 30% dealing with technical debt.
Dealing with technical debt.
Gotcha.
It's a paradigm. All debt or no debt. All features, no features. And what I'm saying is, by and large, a healthy roadmap, all things being equal. We're operating well, have clear line of sight on the abilities, have clear line of sight on scalability, and I do have a clear pipeline on features. 70% features, 30% of working on debt is about the right equation. And then you adjust based on the market and needs of the business. And like you said, if you see something that's going to blow up in 12 months, you probably have to work backwards and start working on that now, and I may have to take on more debt now because it's going to take me a while to work on it. That's how I look at it.
I really like that. I keep thinking I like the pendulum as well, because I feel like every once in a while your team just wants to buckle down and just work on all this backlog of stuff. Like, they really enjoy just like, I don't have to think about a single feature for a while. I can just go and, just get busy, get in there and actually start, unwinding a lot of this bad code, because it's often better done in this very large bulk thing. Like, it just feels better to get it all like sorted and, dusted the whole place and, vacuumed and everything looks perfect and pristine. Okay, now we can start building net new features. But the business has no appetite for that. I can never find a situation where everyone's just okay taking a breather for a while.
Yeah. That I agree, but and that's where it takes the leadership, the develop, not just when I say leadership, the thought leaders that are developers as well as the leaders that are people managers need to band together and paint to the story to the business. This is what matters to the business metrics. This is what matters to the customer. And this is why it's important to look at it and have the discussion. Mm-hmm. It's about a value discussion at that stage. But you always have to pay some level of debt.
I got asked this question last week when I was giving a presentation. I'd love to hear your answer to it. So this guy asked, well, okay, we have all these things going wrong in the company, all these vulnerabilities in their case is what they're talking about. How do I get the board to care? How do I telegraph this message in a way that can trickle all the way through the executive team and actually make it to the board, where the board goes, yeah, it's worth spending time to slow down and fix this stuff, which, by the way, is just technical debt. If you think about it, just another version of it. What is your answer? How do you telegraph that message all the way through the food chain up to the board?
I don't know if there's a one-size-fits-all answer on that one, so let me predecess that. I think you have, and there's reasons for that. The more layers of people you go through, the more opinions you have. And the more opinions they have and louder voices and everything, the more the story changes. That's why we have coconut phones. So I think the thing is what's the damage to the brand? The most important thing people will care about in the board is what's the damage to the brand? What's the damage to customers? What's the damage to our success? If you say, look, this security thing, if we find out, let's say the security thing comes over and they take control over the data, the Humvee, like they know where we are, and that knowing where we are, bad things can happen. And it's easy to do it. And it can happen in X amount, kind of help them understand this is the damage to the business. This is how easily or not it could happen. And this is the ramifications of what it costs to fix it. Now you can facilitate a dialogue. It always is a dialogue. And they may come back and say, show me more, prove it to me. Like I said, the more knots on the coconut phone, the more things will change. But I think it's really starting to work from the value of it that way. And that's what I see work. I read a statistic that by 2025, they're going to have a board member on many companies oriented just towards security, because just the volume of cyber predators doing things is becoming that important to the board. And so we'll see if that happens.
I would be shocked if that happens, but I don't think it's a terrible idea, especially because security people tend to think about the adversarial model in general, which does not just include adversaries in the sentient sense. It's just what could impact the value of this company negatively, and that's a myriad of things, especially if you have more of a business focus. So, yeah, my answer was similar to yours actually. So I'm glad to say we're on the same page. I basically said, I think what you need to do is value the assets, understand what the total expected value of loss is, and times likelihood, percentage of likelihood, and sum up that risk and say, here's the total amount of value that is currently at risk across the company, and I'd like to improve the value of the company. And it's going to be hard for them to say, I don't want more value in the company, because ultimately you're just taking on liability. I got in a very interesting conversation online a couple days ago. Actually, I was kind of trolling it. I was involved, they tagged me in it, so I was watching it, but I wasn't actually interacting. But the current thinking, and I like this thinking, is that companies aren't worth as much as they think they are. They really aren't.
Especially now.
Yeah, well, especially now. But it's just there's this glut of technical debt and sort of IT hygiene issues and security issues, and you forgot to pay XYZ license, and just all this garbage that's sort of hanging out there. And you can insure against some of it. I wouldn't recommend triggering the insurance for a wide variety of reasons, but you can insure against some of it. You can mitigate some of it, but ultimately your company just isn't worth as much as you think it is. So the best you can really do is just hope the acquirer doesn't notice that. And so if you can get a couple spare cycles to clean some of that stuff up and get rid of that technical debt or security issues or whatever, I think that improves the value. And I think that's how you communicate it to CFOs. And once CFOs care, I think that gets up to the board level.
That's another angle as well. Mm-hmm. The CFO.
Yeah. So how do you feel about the delta between traditional employees and 1099s? Since you're running a company now, it's your company, do you think you should have mostly contractors? Do you think, or if you're a small enough company, should you have all contractors so you can burst up and down as needed? How do you feel about that?
That's a great question. In my business, most are 1099. And it's mostly because everybody, my folks are mostly ex-execs like myself, and we're kind of like, sometimes I want to do something, sometimes I don't. Mm-hmm. And so building that flex in the pipe was more important to the business. So that's one thing. Then the next element of it is, as you build the pipeline of your deal flow and you figure it out, in my opinion, it's better to have some contractors. You have a core. My company's me, and a couple other people, but the rest, you have a core figuring out the heavy lifting and some of the other parts of your deal flow. That's where you get the flex and the pipeline. And then once you get like a repeatable, locked in thing that's going, and you can keep them busy. That's the key thing. Repeatably busy and growing. That's when I think you bring on full-timers. Pardon me.
Gotcha. There's a lot of laws that basically say, especially California, they have a lot of laws about this. If someone acts like a employee and they aren't in control of their day, they are an employee. So it's kind of this weird. It's like, I would like to make you a contractor. I would like you to have the burst capacity, and you decide you don't want to work for a couple of weeks or whatever, you don't have to take vacation. You just don't work, whatever. And if I want to bring you back, I bring you back. If I don't, because I think that's annoying, I don't. And that flexibility, I think, works for a lot of people. But I think it'll be interesting to see how the gig economy and in my world, especially web application security, there is a negative unemployment rate. which is to say that every single person working in security has at least one job, if not more than one job.
I was hearing that, not just security developers too.
Yeah. And so I think the world has just got to be prepared for a lot more 1099s, a lot more people who have 2 or 3 things going on all the time. So, I mean, things are more expensive in many ways, so that kind of makes sense. People want more money just to afford the basics. But also, frankly, 9 to 5, a lot of these people have a lot of time on their hands, and like, why not take on another job? And I've got all of my evenings and weekends free. I'm a single person. Why shouldn't I?
You bring up an interesting point. I was just talking to somebody in the recruiting space today, actually, for lunch. And they were telling me employers are starting to get, I won't say who they are, well-known, high-growth, very visible people in Austin. Mm-hmm. And their CEO is like, I'm going to be pulling people back in office because my developers are stealing from me when they work remotely. And they're like, why? And they're like, because they've got 3 laptops. I can only see mine, but they're coding for 2 other companies at the same time they're coding for me. Mm-hmm. But I'm the one paying them and giving them the benefits. So there is a pro and con of the gig economy like you're describing, absolutely. Right? Mm-hmm. I see both sides of the coin. I think we're about to figure it out over the next 18 months. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, but that's a rough one because now you're having to monitor people in their homes or get them to physically come in, which they hate, or a lot. Not everybody. Some people like that, but a lot of developers just like, why? I could be doing this on the beach. Why do I need to physically come into office to do this?
Well, depending on how the world's economy goes, will it matter anyway? Right? Mm-hmm. We're starting to see the layoffs, the pullbacks. I mean, what I see in the market is we have the growth companies that are continuing to grow and invest, and then we have people that are just kind of scaling back and working incrementally, and nobody in between. I'm not seeing anybody in between. That's foretelling things are slowing down, right? And so if you're slowing down, will the gig economist have that many choices anyways? And so will it just naturally flush itself out? I don't know. We're going to find out in the next 18 months.
Yeah, I do. At minimum, I think the people doing that are going to have to be a lot more sensitive to telegraphing to that to their major places they're making money, whoever that is, their major job, let's say. I don't know how to phrase that exactly. Their primary source of income. So I think this will be interesting to watch how this all plays out. I'm a little concerned that what it means is employers are going to feel like they have an even greater reason to overreach and get into people's laptops. So, for instance, some of the conversations I've been having, and I'll get somebody on here who focuses on these types of issues, they have a duty of care issue, which means they are physically required to pick up the phone and call the police when they figured out, because they're monitoring somebody's laptop or whatever, that, they're beating their spouse or, they're doing drugs or whatever. Like now they're required to pick up the phone and call because they have evidence of a crime. So the more draconian you get, the more liability the company takes on to know these things.
It's actually a valid point.
Yeah. And I'm worried that companies are not, first of all, they have no business in people's homes, really.
I agree.
But secondly, you're just taking on a lot of risk. I mean, granted, it's nice to catch the bad guy every once in a while, for sure. I mean, everyone wants the bad guy off the street, but the costs associated with it are just enormous. And who wants to work in that kind of environment? So it's a HR morale issue just to a level that I think is just not worth it.
That'd be a big discussion. That's a very deep and broad conversation, for sure.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy, huh? So, okay, so you're doing some side stuff too, as well. You have another job.
Yeah.
You're writing for some...
Yeah, I write for Newsweek and Fastcompany. Mm-hmm. So I write about cloud innovation, digital transformation, and entrepreneur leadership. Mm-hmm. And so that's been kind of fun. I had never written before, and so I have learned. I've gotten good feedback. In fact, in the last few weeks, the editors of both said, your articles have high readership. We'd like more.
Okay, great.
And so went through and built out a list for
So you're going to get
articles.
a team to write this for you.
No. I'm actually, I have a theory on that one. What I have found is you lose your voice when that happens.
Of course you do.
And so you wind up writing it yourself anyway. And so I'd rather just crunch it out and do it. So yes, I have that going.
So how do people find you? We've talked about a lot of different things. Do you have social media? Like, how do they?
Yeah. Thank you for asking. So I'm on LinkedIn, Matt Domo. You could search on me on LinkedIn. We have a company page on LinkedIn, FifthVantage. We also have a website, FifthVantage.com or info@FifthVantage.com. Those are the main way. Lots of people reach out on LinkedIn. I talk to people all over the place. I'm actually pretty open to that, so feel free to drop me a line. I'm happy to talk and help and have a conversation like this.
That's great. I just think it's really funny that you have 2 jobs after all this conversation.
Yeah, well, I actually
You're
have
not alone, my friend. You are not alone.
I guess I'm a true gigist,
That's
right?
right. That's absolutely right. Well, Matt, this has been great. I really appreciate it.
Hey, thank you for the opportunity. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
we talked about things I haven't thought about in a while, but it was good.
Appreciate it, man.
Thank you.